Minister in the Office of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs.
Madam President, I thank you most sincerely for the opportunity to join and, my 2 pence and add my 2 pence, to this debate. Coming at this stage in the debate, Madam President, of course, I would have had the benefit to sit and listen to all of my colleagues in the Senate, those who would have contributed. And I want to begin by firstly commending the independent bench for their sober contribution to this debate. And of course, the recommendations that some members of the independent bench would have presented today, that also must be highly commended and recognized. And, I know a lot of the questions and queries in particular, made by members of the independent bench were particularly addressed to my senior, the Honourable Attorney General, and I am most certain that the AG, in his winding up, will address some of those concerns. So after recognizing, of course, the stellar contribution, sober contribution made by the independent bench, Madam President, I now want to turn to the contribution made by the opposition. Now, there were Senator Naked, Senator Wademark, Senator John, and Senator Lakshmi Dayal, the opposition members, would have contributed to this debate. And, it really have me wondering whether or not the senators took the time to read the bill, or whether or not they continue. It is the modus operandi of the opposition. I heard Senator Naked use that word 100 times in his presentation. But I wonder if it is their constant attempt to mislead the population as it relates to issues of law that this bill would have addressed. Madam President, what was amazing to me personally was that Senator Naked comes to this Senate constantly, and he speaks as a champion for the poor and working class. Senator Naked comes to this Senate constantly, and he speaks about the government neglect for taking care of the poor and working class. And my respectful response to that, Madam President, is that by regulating this industry and by putting measures in place to ensure that those who engage in the scrap iron industry, those who are either collectors, those who are other dealers, the measures that we are implementing today, Madam President, it is because we want these small industries to develop, we want them to grow, we want them to be able to truly flourish. So, Madam President, I cannot understand how Senator Naked will constantly come here speaking about, and I will draw on a very personal experience. I was a teacher in a school, a high school, for more than 8 years of my life. And I had the benefits and the blessings and the privilege to teach children who belong to the poor and working class. And you know what my modus operandi was then, Madam President? I will throw them to the finish line. I am not, because that is how you try to progress a nation. That is how you try to progress a people. You don't just simply condone irregularities. You don't condone a system or a regime that no doubt is lacking some structure. What you attempt to do is to try to put measures in place in order to uplift that industry, Madam President. And I have to make that point because Senator Naked, in making that point, and you see, he's smart because he's speaking to the population, and he's using this attempt by the government to genuinely improve the industry so that those who engage in the industry can no doubt eventually benefit from it. He has used this scrap metal bill to somewhat try to incite that belief that this government does not care about our population, does not care about our poor, does not care about our working class. And what is amazing in doing that, Senator Naked, how can you want to progress a nation, Madam President, when you want to stand in defense of a 16-year-old working in a scrap iron dealership? And that's why I made the reference to working with my students when I was a teacher. You see, if I want a nation, I want children, I want people to progress, I would create an enabling environment that allows them to progress. And that is exactly what this bill attempts to do. This bill attempts to regularize the industry. In the effort, the policy behind it is to create an enabling environment. So those little poor people who we have made mention of, persons who are not academically qualified to engage in this industry, we create an enabling environment so that they could put their houses in order. They could really create from these smaller businesses, grow into flourishing entities that could one day compete with any big or large business. And I come back to that 16-year-old. A 16-year-old, and I know Senator Richards, in his stellar contribution, he made mention about not supporting a 16-year-old working in a scrap iron dealership. And I agree with that. A 16-year-old deserves to be in school. We as government, when we are creating law, Madam President, yes, we take the social, we have social considerations, but we also have to mark and measure that with other international obligations that we may have and other pieces of law that are in existence. So on the point of that 16-year-old, Madam President, being able to, and Senator Naked using it in this Senate as if it's the government's intention to deprive young people who want to enter into the industry. What I can say to the Honourable Senator is that as a responsible government, we have to be minded of our International Convention on the Rights of a Child. We have to be reminded when we are creating legislation, we have these international obligations. So then how can we legislate and accept that a 16-year-old could enter into a workforce? Added to which, I've heard a lot of arguments relative to that same 16-year-old child being allowed to work in the scrap iron dealership. That is part of the 16-year-olds that work, What about the ones who are coerced into working? What about the ones who are subject to child labor? What about the ones who the gangs rope them in and force them to work into these scrap yards or into any business, as a matter of fact? So, you see, as a responsible government, of course we have to do a balancing act. But our balancing act is balancing, of course, regulating the industry, but the protection of the rights of our vulnerable, the protection of the rights of those people who work within these industries. And, because I knew her, and I don't believe as I see a woman, but for the 2 years or so I've sat in the Senate, I know what they were going to come here, the opposition was going to come here and do again. And the central theme was to prove and say to this country that this this law that we are presenting is because we don't care about the poor and working class. And because of that, man, and I know Senator Mark, in his contribution, he referred to this bill as the funeral service of the scrap iron industry. But I will say to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, Madam President, respectfully through you, as a matter of fact, this is not the funeral service, this is the baptism of the scrap iron industry. And I will tell you why it's the baptism of the scrap iron industry, because baptism, to my mind, it speaks about the purification, the rejuvenation. And this bill that we are presenting today, Madam President, yes, the bill is not perfect. Yes, there will be more to come as time goes by. But it is critical as a government for us to be able to step in at the time in which we did step in order to improve the industry. And that is why, Madam President, I want in my contribution to specifically speak, Madam President, to all of our scrap iron dealers, all of our scrap iron collectors, persons who engage in this industry. And I want to speak to you particularly to draw to your attention, Madam President, the benefits that the regularization of this bill, that this bill presents, Madam President, that it brings to you, those who your bread and butter is dependent on the scrap iron, on the scrap iron regulation. So I started off by saying that this bill, of course, Madam President, in my respectful view, it is more, to my mind, it's more of a baptism of this industry, a rejuvenation of this industry, and it is evident in clauses that exist. Clauses 15.5, clauses 16.2, clauses 17.2, clauses 17.3, clauses 25.7. These are some of the clauses, Madam President, President, in this bill that, to my mind, respectfully, will assist more than they can probably even foresee. It will assist considerably in the operation, and more so, Madam President, the protection of those people who engage in this particular industry. So, for example, Madam President, if I respectfully, Madam President, begin by looking at Clause 15, for example, of this bill. Clause 15 of this bill, Madam President, it requires that the scrap metal collector obtain a signed statement of ownership from the person whom he is buying the scrap iron. It requires that the seller state to the effect that he is the legal owner of the scrap metal, or that he is legally entitled to sell the scrap metal. You know why this is critical, and I'm hoping and praying that my brothers and sisters who engage in this industry are paying attention, or at least I just want to have that conversation with you. You know why this is critical to your use and why this is critical to your operations, Madam President? In my practice as an attorney, I had several cases. I was a defense counsel, so there's no secret about that. So, of course, the persons who will come to me would be the persons who are charged, right, with particular offenses. In this, I distinctly recall that there was a matter in which I did, Madam President, when I was in private practice, in which my client engaging in the scrap iron industry, he was charged, but he was charged under the Larceny Act for the possession of stolen goods. And this was a bona fide person, to my mind, because I had known this client for very many years, and I know that this is somebody who legitimately operated his business. He operated his business, of course, within the confines of what the old law required him to do. He would take once someone comes to purchase scrap metal from him, he would take a copy of the ID, because those were the provisions that the old law required. He would take a copy of their ID. He would take their name, their addresses, and of course, you just make a document, you make a note of where, how much, of course, you were purchasing, right? And this was a case, of course, it's not sub judice because it has already been ventilated before the courts. In this particular matter, Madam President, it was a case where the person who came to sell him the scrap metal said to him, well, it's a company that's closing down, and we're trying to get a quick sale of this metal, right? And he proceeded to go, because remember, there's no regulation as to, or requirement, there's no statement as to the fixed requirement that you're supposed to check, the check boxes you're supposed to take by purchasing this metal. And what he would have done, Madam President, is, of course, he would have purchased it. To his mind, the person would have simply said, I am the owner, is our brother and sister company, they're closing down, this is, we're selling out the scrap metal fast. And he would have, to his mind, did what he was supposed to do and would have purchased the items. Lo and behold, less than a week after, the police shows up in his scrap iron dealership, and of course charges him for the possession of stolen goods. Of course, the matter went through the courts. Eventually, we won, I must say so. So the charges were dismissed against him. But the point that I'm making, and let me tell you why he had to go through this particular trauma, because you see that basic information he took, the persons who sold him it, they absconded. When the police started the investigation, they're looking at the IDs, they can't find them. They have no clue. The addresses the police showed up to during the investigation, they can't find them. You understand? And all of this particular provision, Madam President, especially coming from a defense background and coming from a litigation background and going through the courts, you understand that what this does is provide an additional layer of evidence. When it comes to police investigation, when it comes to successfully convicting in the courts. So I want to say to the scrap iron dealers, especially the legitimate ones, do not be afraid of the provisions within this law. What it actually seeks to do is to protect you. And more so, we have come here and we have spoken about the kinds of persons who engages in this industry. Yes, there are persons who probably came from very poor backgrounds. You more than
ever deserve that protection. You more than ever deserves a government like this government to protect your interests. And that, Madam President, and this is just one of the clauses in this bill, Madam President. Madam President, if we look, for example, at clause 16.2, it speaks about the protection that the bill provides. This bill provides to the scrap metal collectors. The scrap metal collectors, for example, in this particular clause, Madam President, it speaks to having to portray while they're driving about, they will put their license will be seen. You know what that does? That prevents this poor man from the police just pulling you across. I think it was Senator Jillian John in her contribution. She spoke about, well, of course, it's a black man, so the police will pull them over. You know what? This protects our boys. This protects the vulnerable. So I have my license. I have my license displayed. The police have no reason to question if I'm engaged in a legitimate business. You understand? So whether coming out of Beaton, whether coming out from wherever on East West, wherever I'm coming from, I have displayed my license, and therefore, once the police looks at it, the police verifies this is a legitimate license, the police will know, well, of course, this can't be a bandit. This have to be somebody who have legitimately satisfied the qualifications to be engaged in this business. So again, Madam President, respectfully through you see the propaganda that the UNC, the opposition, Madam President, has attempted to put on the record today. That is why I had to jump in at this stage and to clear that record. Because it is absolutely pertinent, it is absolutely critical, Madam President, for us to be able to protect those our vulnerable. So, Madam President, as I said, it was just a very, now there are several other clauses, but I just want to reiterate in my closing, in my very, very short contribution, Madam President, this is an attempt of the government, the bill that appears before us, it continues to be an attempt of our government to protect the rights of the vulnerable, to protect the rights of every single person who engages in the scrap metal industry. With those few words, Madam President, I thank you for the opportunity.
Minister of Trade and Industry.